The disappearance of an entire naval expedition leaves a void that defies standard forensic analysis. When the physical evidence vanishes, investigators are left with only secondary assumptions and geographical guesswork. This was the exact operational reality surrounding a massive mission that departed in 1845. The objective was to chart the last unnavigated sections of a route through an unforgiving frozen archipelago. A total complement of 129 men sailed north and systematically dropped off the map. Decades of subsequent search efforts yielded scattered relics, but the primary forensic platform was missing. The flagship Arabus was entirely erased from the physical record. It stood as a permanent blind spot in naval history. You cannot reconstruct a terminal failure without the hull. The central mechanism of the loss was an operational decision forced by a collapsing timeline. The ships became physically locked in the pack ice. The frozen sea refused to release the timber hulls. On April 22, 1848, the surviving 105 crew members reached a critical threshold. The stationary logistics chain was exhausted. They abandoned the vessels. On April 26th, they stepped out onto the frozen strait in a desperate bid to march south toward safety. This abandonment was a forced tactical pivot. They traded the robust shelter of the heavy wooden ships for the extreme exposure of the open ice. It was a fatal calculation. Starvation, illness, and exposure finished what the ice began. When the crew deserted the ships, they left the primary forensic evidence behind. The flagship Arabus became a ghost vessel. It was no longer guided by human navigation. It was captured by the slow, grinding mechanics of ice and current. The abandoned flagship may have been moved season by season through the maze of islands and channels. It moved at the mercy of prevailing currents and freeze cycles. For over a century and a half, its final resting place remained unknown. The geographical grid was simply too vast, and the search windows were too narrow to locate a single wooden hull lost in an endless sequence of bays and straits. The breakthrough required a complete shift in search methodology and decades of technological advancement. The silence was finally broken on September 2, 2014. The search operation deployed modern remote sensing to methodically scan the seabed. A towed side-scan sonar unit was pulled through the dark waters of Wilmot and Crampton Bay, and the team followed the target with visual confirmation tools once the signal appeared. These acoustic instruments send out wide pulses of sound, mapping the topography of the ocean floor and searching for anything that deviates from the natural geology. The sonar sweep registered a massive anomaly. The acoustic return was sharp, geometric, and completely unnatural. The data painted a picture of a large, coherent structure resting on the seabed. The target was unmistakably a 19th century naval vessel. The flagship Arabus had finally been pinpointed. The sonar data revealed a staggering reality. The ship was not scattered across a massive debris field. It was sitting upright on the bottom. The three-dimensional lower hull was intact. It was a preserved forensic vault, holding lower decks and storage spaces in remarkable condition, with many features still in place from the expedition's final months. The discovery ended one of the longest searches in maritime history. However, locating the flagship immediately triggered a new crisis. The ship was structurally recognizable, but its exact coordinates exposed a fatal vulnerability. The upright hull was not resting in the deep, static abyss where time and temperature effectively freeze deterioration. The side-scan sonar had found the vessel in an area that presented a severe and immediate physical threat. The discovery answered the fundamental question of where the ship drifted, but it exposed the wreck to an environmental clock that was ticking down rapidly. The exact depth and placement of the site transformed a static, historical triumph into an urgent salvage emergency. The vertical geometry of a resting place usually dictates the survival of any shipwreck. In many wreck environments, the most punishing forces are not quiet depth, but shallow water motion, waves, surge, and seasonal ice. This specific Arctic environment presents a complete physical inversion of the usual expectations people carry into shipwreck preservation. The newly located flagship rests at a depth of about 36 feet, roughly 11 meters. This is not a shallow water sanctuary, it is a geographical trap. The shallow position places the upright wooden structure directly into the strike zone of the harshest environmental hazard on the planet. To understand this anomaly, Our investigators only need to look at the expedition sister ship, Her Majesty's Ship Terror. That second vessel rests in a sheltered bay at about 80 feet. At that depth, the hull is better buffered from the worst surface-driven ice and wave energy, leaving it remarkably intact. The flagship does not possess that vital vertical buffer. At its much shallower depth, its highest surviving structures sit directly in the danger band. The threat is defined by the extreme mechanics of winter pack ice. When the surface of the polar ocean freezes, it does not form a smooth, static sheet. Wind and ocean currents force massive plates of frozen seawater to collide. The edges buckle and raft together, compressing into multi-ton ridges of solid ice. As these massive pressure ridges build upward into the air, their corresponding frozen keels are driven deep down into the water column. These jagged ice keels can reach several meters below the surface, and in some cases extend to depths comparable to 20 or 30 feet. Because the wooden flagship sits perfectly upright on a 36-foot seabed, its uppermost sections project upward straight into this deep penetration zone. The shallow ocean floor effectively acts as a solid, immovable anvil. Every winter, the shifting ice keels transform into a slow-motion hammer. The sheer kinetic mass of a moving, multi-ton ice field is effectively unstoppable. When these deep keels scrape across the shallow bottom, they possess enough force to gouge deep trenches directly into the solid seabed. The 19th century wooden hull stands squarely in the path of this seasonal scouring action. Each season, moving ice can deliver its horizontal momentum directly into the stationary wreck. In deeper water, ice keels can pass overhead without ever contacting the wreck. Here, the hull is forced into a repeating scouring cycle at the depth band where ice and bottom interact. Mechanical trauma, not slow corrosion. Each winter freeze and spring breakup drives shifting ice and wave energy through the depth band that intersects the wreck. With no deep water buffer, the structure is forced into the same abrasion cycle year after year. For the investigative team, the site is on an operational clock. In shallow Arctic water, storms, wave energy, and seasonal ice accelerate collapse and scatter material. The usable window to document and recover vulnerable evidence narrows with every season. Sonar could map geometry in total darkness, but it could not read a nameplate. That limitation shaped the first phase of the search. The sweep produced a sharp, coherent return that outlined a ship-sized structure on the seabed. Side-scan shadows showed the wreck sitting upright with an intact lower hull and a limited debris halo, enough to turn the bay into a defined forensic grid and end the purely blind phase of the search. However, an acoustic anomaly does not equal positive identification. The history of the region is filled with lost whaling ships, abandoned trading boats, and failed exploration vessels. A sonar return is only a shape. It cannot confirm the exact origin of the timber. To bridge the gap between an acoustic target and a definitive historical confirmation, the team needed an unmistakable physical signature, and they needed one defining piece of hardware that survived the sinking process. To move from an acoustic shape to a historical ID, the team shifted to a focused visual search for a durable signature artifact. On the upper structure, they found it, an intact cast metal ship's bell on the decking. The bronze bell provided the absolute verification the investigators demanded. The cast surface of the metal bore two defining physical markings. First, it was deeply stamped with the broad arrow property mark, the official designation for hardware owned by the British Royal Navy. Second, it carried the stamped year of 1845. That signature did what sonar alone could not. It pushed the identification past probability and into confirmation that would be strengthened by continued survey and documentation at the site. With the identity confirmed, investigators used the accumulated sonar data to build a complete baseline map of the site. The acoustic models outlined the wreck's footprint, its orientation, and the surrounding debris field, enough to turn a vast bay into a defined forensic grid. From there, closer visual surveys could begin to reveal what lay inside the surviving structure. That same baseline carried a warning. The lower hull appeared intact, but the upper structures showed severe disruption. Mapping highlighted a critical failure point above the preserved compartments, indicating an unstable roofline. A preserved lower hull is only secure as long as its protective upper boundary maintains absolute rigidity. The physical architecture of the flagship is currently trapped in a catastrophic dual-directional tear. The lowest sections of the heavy wooden hull are firmly locked into the protective sediment of the seabed. However, the uppermost decks are caught in an active, escalating physical crisis. The external architecture is failing under an entirely different mechanical stress than simple biological decay. It is being violently ripped apart by opposing kinetic forces that exploit every weakness in the 19th century timber construction. The primary engine of this structural destruction comes from the intense kinetic energy of surface storm swells. When severe weather systems move across the bay, they generate powerful wave action and surge. In shallow water, that motion can reach down to the wreck, flexing timbers, disturbing joints, and accelerating collapse in the most exposed upper structures. While the summer storm swells exert a relentless upward ripping motion, the harsh winter environment delivers massive downward mechanical strikes. Because the upper profile of the ship sits squarely in the hazard zone, it is subjected to immense vertical compression. The massive upper support beams and heavy cross timbers are completely destabilized. They are first loosened and pulled upward by the lifting action of the storm waves, and then brutally hammered downward by the freezing environment. This constant, alternating cycle of upward pull and downward crush systematically destroys the structural integrity of the complex timber joints. Fasteners loosen, timbers shift. The connections that once held the deck rigid begin to fail under repeated stress. The inevitable result is a catastrophic architectural failure directly above the intact forensic vaults. The main weather deck and the upper support structures are completely caving in. This creates what structural engineers recognize as a collapsing structural ceiling. Hundreds of tons of heavy oak planking, massive transverse support beams, and heavy iron deck fittings are no longer acting as a secure protective roof. Instead, this entire destabilized mass is actively dropping downward, section by heavy section, straight into the preserved internal compartments. The ship is effectively consuming itself from the top down. The lowest compartments of the vessel hold the richest concentration of untouched historical evidence. These tightly sealed internal spaces contain fragile organic materials, delicate navigation instruments, and personal effects that have survived for over a century and a half purely because they were physically isolated. As the structural ceiling aggressively collapses, massive, waterlogged timber beams plunge directly through the interior floorboards. The sheer, unyielding weight of the falling wood systematically crushes the delicate historical evidence trapped below. The protective internal vault is actively transforming into a highly compressed debris zone. The carefully constructed physical boundaries of the officers' cabins and the primary storage holds are being completely obliterated under the immense weight of their own collapsing roof. For modern teams, the constraint is measurable. Each season adds more fallen timber, reducing access to the lower compartments and crushing what remains. The working volume is shrinking, and the most fragile organic evidence is on a short timetable. To save the vital forensic record, surgical physical extraction must be executed immediately before the structural collapse is absolute. The heavy, unstable debris must be carefully navigated, and the tight, rapidly compressing spaces must be penetrated by human hands. This structural reality forces the investigative team into a highly dangerous operational posture. The delicate artifact extraction requires extreme manual precision, forcing human divers to remain completely motionless for extended periods while suspended in lethal, freezing water. In near-freezing water, stillness buys precision but steals dexterity. Cold rapidly degrades fine motor control and decision speed, tightening the safe window for careful handling. To override this hard physiological limit, the salvage engineering team deployed a highly specialized surface-supplied life support system. They completely bypassed passive thermal insulation and transitioned to active heat generation. The divers are equipped with heavy hot water suits. This system operates on a direct umbilical link to the surface support barge. Massive industrial boilers on the deck pump a continuous high-volume stream of heated water down through heavily insulated hoses. The water flushes directly inside the sealed suit, constantly washing over the skin of the diver before venting out into the freezing ocean. This creates a highly controlled, artificial microclimate perfectly tailored to the individual. This active heating system rewrote the operational rules of polar diving. By delivering heat from the surface, the team pushed past the brutally short cold limit and opened a longer working window on the bottom, often long enough for careful, methodical documentation instead of rushed emergency grabs. With the physiological limit solved, the team deployed highly specialized extraction hardware. Heavy mechanical claws would instantly destroy the waterlogged organic evidence buried inside the lower hull. Instead, the divers utilized specialized water induction dredges. The system let them move fine sediment gently, clearing silt without the harsh mechanical action that would shred waterlogged organic evidence. The diver controls this intake nozzle with absolute precision. Hovering motionless inside the hot water suit, the operator uses small trowels and simple hand fanning techniques to loosen the heavy, compacted sediment inside the lower cabins. The water induction dredge gently vacuums away the resulting silt cloud. It systematically lifts the obscuring mud and fine sand without ever exposing the buried artifacts to the violent mechanical action of a hard impeller blade. The heavy sediment is sucked upward and safely discharged far away from the fragile work zone. This paired methodology of continuous thermal support and gentle vacuum extraction achieved exactly what standard salvage operations could not. The careful dredging safely peeled back a century and a half of accumulated mud. As the final layer of blinding sediment was cleared away from the wooden floorboards, the surgical approach yielded a stunning forensic return. The localized vacuum perfectly preserved the structural integrity of the tightest spaces. The clearing operation successfully exposed highly fragile, completely untouched organic material that should have dissolved over a century ago. The surgical operations executed during a recent archaeological field season yielded an astonishing 275 artifacts. The yield did not consist solely of heavy iron hardware or durable brass fittings. The slow, highly controlled sediment clearing process helped liberate some of the most fragile materials ever recovered from a marine environment. Every individual object was systematically mapped within the three-dimensional grid before it was carefully lifted to the surface. Among the most highly valued recoveries was an embossed leather book cover or folio. In standard underwater environments, leather and paper are rapidly consumed by biological decay or destroyed by mechanical action. In this tight forensic vault, the heavy sediment and near-freezing temperatures slowed that clock, but whether any interior pages or writing survived can only be determined through conservation work on the surface. Finding that cover elevated the mission from a simple hardware recovery into a profound historical rescue. The team successfully extracted delicate clothing, intricate navigation tools, and personal effects that link back to the expedition's final days. Extracting hundreds of priceless historical items from an active environmental hazard required the implementation of a strict legal and ethical framework. The operation could not function as a traditional, unregulated commercial salvage grab. To secure the long-term integrity of the operation, the entire shipwreck site was placed under a cooperative management doctrine. The protected waters are collaboratively managed by Parks Canada and Inuit partners, including the Inuit Heritage Trust and the Natalik Heritage Society, with support from the Kitikmeot Inuit Association. This shared stewardship helps ensure that every physical recovery is meticulously cataloged, legally protected, and ethically managed from the moment it leaves the water. Under the Joint Management Team, a Guardian program monitors the surface waters above the site during the short, navigable summer season. Local monitors help manage visitors when programs allow and report suspicious activity through the proper channels to deter unauthorized access and damage. The overall operation stands as an absolute success. The disciplined archaeological extraction achieved every stated forensic objective. The investigative team successfully documented the exact physical footprint of the lost flagship, quantified the rate of structural deterioration over time, and safely excavated the most vulnerable organic evidence before the timber hull could fully compress. Hundreds of total artifacts have been securely relocated from the seabed to specialized national conservation laboratories. These specialized facilities utilize complex chemical stabilization to permanently preserve the waterlogged wood, fragile leather, and ancient paper. The evidence is now permanently locked in climate-controlled preservation, completely safe from the surrounding freezing waters. The artifacts may be secure, but the wooden hull itself cannot be saved. The stewardship program can document and monitor each new collapse, but it cannot arrest the physical forces in the bay. The wreck will continue to break apart even as its remaining structure is recorded.